and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Jessica Zavala, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health to today's webinar, Campus Safety Prevention with a Purpose. Before I introduce our presenter for today, I do have just a few brief announcements to share. First off, if you're interested in obtaining CME-CEU credits, the activity code for today's session is 36WILL. That is 36WILL. This code will expire on tomorrow, October 13th at 1 p.m. So please be on the lookout for information periodically posted via the chat function regarding how to obtain CME and CEU credits. Next, we also invite you to join us for our upcoming November webinar. That's on November 8th at 11 a.m. We will be joined by Dr. Evelyn Rivera, who is the founder and director of I Am Who I Am Wellness and Proyecto Raíces, Dr. Magda Gomez and Jessica Cartagena from Cuyahoga Community College, and Iris Morales from right here at NeoMed, as we host a panel discussion on pioneering a path forward, engaging and understanding the vitality of needs for Latinx students. Also, stay tuned for future webinar topics that will cover a variety of topics that we've heard directly from you that we so look forward to bring into our webinar series. Again, please be on the lookout for details via our listserv. And we also invite you to follow our social media sites and or webpage for upcoming events. For today's webinar, this will be an interactive presentation. We also do encourage you to post questions and or comments in the Q&A or chat function. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and the video will be made available for viewing on our YouTube channel. And now to introduce our presenter, Joe Hendry, Senior Director of On-Site Services at Navigate 360. Joe was named by the Ohio Department of Homeland Security and the Ohio Attorney General's Office as an expert in civilian and law enforcement response to active threats. He is an ACES International member with PSP certification appointed to the School Safety and Security Community Steering Committee. He served 6 years in the United States Marine Corps and 27 years with Kent State Police Department, so our neighbor here. He is a AM Best Recommended Expert Service Provider for the insurance industry and holds a bachelor's degree in telecommunication. Currently, Joe is principal appointed to Cross-Functional Emergency Preparedness and Response Committee for NFPA 3000 to write national standard for civilian law enforcement, fire service, and emergency services. He was issued the classification of special expert by NFPA. And so without further ado, I would turn it over to Joe. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Jessica. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. I know we're going to pull some slides up here in a second. Those are getting pulled up and everything. I have someone clicking through these, so you hear me a couple of times during the presentation say that I need the next slide. So if we can get that one popped off of there, please. That's kind of the biography that Jessica just read. I would just add, as part of my duties with NFPA 3000, we have subcommittees inside NFPA 3000. I sit on 2 of the subcommittees. I sit on the K-12 subcommittee for the standard response for education in K-12 and infrastructure appointment and psychological programs. I also sit in the recovery phase of that document as a member of the subcommittee. And a lot of, while we look at the recovery phase from major critical incidents like an active shooter or an act of terrorism, a large piece of that and the individuals that I work with on that subcommittee is very much grounded in mental health, not only for the victims of an incident, but also for the first responders and families. We're actually in the process right now. We've been in the process of updating that document now with new information for the last 6 months. We've just sent it back to the public for comment, which has really opened my eyes a lot of times on things that we saw, and maybe things I believed as a law enforcement officer have changed considerably in the last 6 years since I went into the private sector, including a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So if I have the next slide, please. So a little bit about Navigate 360. You might know us by some different names. I came from the Alice side of the house. I was a national trainer for Alice in active shooter response for almost 10 years, traveling all over the country. Company says I was probably in classrooms with about 40,000 students. I trained over 3,000 instructors. We were combined with Safe Plans, which was another security company out of Tampa, Florida, and Navigate Prepared, which was mainly software, back in 2019. And in 2020, we added the 4 companies that are listed right there to kind of expand our offerings and make the company probably the most well-rounded company in the country when it comes to providing school-based solutions. And we actually do a lot of work in education at the university level and with businesses and hospital systems. So now, present day, we're Navigate 360. We are averaging, I think, around 250 employees right now. The division I run is comprised of the mapping that came from Navigate Prepared and the risk assessment division that came from Alice with part of Safe Plans built into it. So I have about 20 employees who work for me nationally, mapping buildings and doing risk assessments all over the US. Next slide, please. So when we talk about why we went to a more well-rounded solution, it's because solutions work better in concert with each other. One of the things for years, I was focused on training piece, the response piece for an active shooter or active terrorism. And while I had come from an education background at Kent State and law enforcement, and I understood the physical security pieces, I understood some of the underlying psychological pieces from being a crisis intervention team officer. What I didn't really understand and what I really didn't get a lot of training in was how all of those pieces fit together. When we're talking about mental health and wellness, what does that mean? I was very good at the initial meeting with CIT and getting people to talk to me and relax a little bit so we could start dealing with their mental health problems, but I always, ended up taking them somewhere else to deal with the long-term effects of it. But really, I needed to understand why we were doing suicide awareness and prevention and why social emotional learning is so important, and moving to the safety management preparedness pieces and understanding, like, how does an emergency management suite work? How do all your documents work in concert together? Why is it important to have them all in one location? Why is it important to have visitor management systems and e-learning? And, the basis of really everything you do is risk assessment. I'm in Los Angeles right now doing risk assessment for a very large private school in northern LA. And the security person that I'm working with here at the school is actually, one of the top people in the country at his job. We spent the last day and a half together, and really it's opening his eyes to what risk assessment is for organizations. And then building into the things like behavioral threat assessment and suicide case management and how you've identified behavioral problems, behavioral threats and suicide, how those all work together. How do you follow up with those? Training your staff to be prepared to deal with these issues, and how do you conduct behavioral threat assessments? How do you actually do suicide prevention? How do you use things like tip lines and web filtering and care alerts to really build all of these pieces together? And you're preparing, protecting, and preventing events. Nothing's 100% foolproof. Events will still happen. That's why you need things like response plans like Alice. That's why you need continuity of operation plans, in case something happens, to help you and aid in your recovery. But it's important to have very comprehensive policies and procedures and training to get people to really understand why things work better together and how they work in conjunction. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of where we're at. Just for some context, there's about 100,000 school buildings in the United States. We are using about 35% of those, over 35,000. That's constantly growing. The number of businesses we're in, we've done work a lot with government facilities on local, state, and federal levels. Right now, we're working with close to 19 million people in their organizations in the United States. The tip lines that we operate, there's been millions of tips. Everyone kind of at one point thought tip lines for active shooter, but really the most common reported incidents are suicide threats and bullying and cyberbullying of students. And those are the things that lead to larger problems. And the interdiction of those is very important. We've got 2.1 million students that we have accountability for, which improves your continuity of operation plans, improves your reunification, helps solve some problems with reunification and accountability, really trying to let us know how those pieces work together and help the organizations before, during, and after incidents. Next slide, please. So one of the things you want to do is create a culture of safety on your campuses. This is really important, and it requires cross-functional collaboration, not only of your people, but of your products that you utilize. The second thing we want to talk about today is being prepared to support students through mental health crises and with compassion. A lot of times we think about behavioral threat assessment as someone's made a threat and we're trying to prevent the threat from occurring by establishing whether the person has the ability to carry out the threat or the means to carry out the threat. And actually, it should be going way beyond that. When we talk about behavioral threat assessment is not only to prevent crimes of violence, though that is a function of it. It's really to help students and sometimes even staff with behavioral issues. I was talking this morning with my host, and he said last week they had a student that something happened in the classroom. It wasn't anything earth-shattering, but the student has PTSD from a previous incident in their life. This is a private school. It's a contained campus. And she went out and was standing by her car, and he saw her, and she's usually very gregarious when she sees him, waves, talks to him, gives him a hug. And what happened was when he saw her, she was obviously a little bit upset, a little bit standoffish. She was sitting in her car, so he kind of pulled up on his golf cart that he was driving to talk to her. And here she had experienced an incident with her PTSD. She was crying in the car. He went and got another staff member to get their school psychologist. They were able to talk her out of the car and help the student. That really wasn't a behavioral threat, but it was a behavioral issue with the student that needed addressed, and they were in a mental health crisis. And he dealt with her with compassion and helped solve the problem. So those are things we're going to talk about today. How does that happen? How do people get the right kind of training? What is the right kind of training? We'll talk about effective threat detection and prevention, and how and why that requires a very comprehensive approach. There's no one solution that's going to fit every single problem, and we shouldn't look at things that way. And then really, number 4 is probably, maybe not number 4, it might actually be number 1. This is probably the greatest resource that we have that we don't use, is students need to be encouraged and equipped and trained to speak up when they see something. I was just talking with one of my coworkers who was out on a job, who reports to me. He was at a school district, and the reason we're there is they had an incident with a firearm brought onto the school property, is what the initial incident was. And through interviews and everything, he found out that one of the things that happened was there were 20, from looking at their video cameras, there were 27 students during the day, and actually found this gun at 3:08 p.m. and the student ended up being arrested, and school let out at 3:15, but the student had the gun all day, and it actually showed it to 27 different students during the day, none of whom said anything. It's how do you overcome that student not want to be a rat and tell on somebody, and get everyone to understand that people do understand the issue. They understand the problem. They're going to deal with it effectively. And we were talking about it last night, and the students apparently at the school aren't trained to report things. They have things on paper that talk about, see something, say something, but they're not getting any training. It's not a cultural build-in with the school that is part of their security options and their safety options. And that's the one piece, that could have ended very badly for them. When you go back and look and see 27 people were shown a gun during a day and no one said anything, that's a much bigger problem. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to address building a culture of safety on the campuses. Go ahead, next slide. So these issues that you see on the screen right now not only are affecting students, but they're also affecting staff. Another staff issue that we're running into that we're observing on risk assessments is we've had a couple of schools now that actually experienced 50% turnover in staff from last year to this. Everyone's experiencing stress and anxiety, isolation. It's not just because of the pandemic, though that is part of it. There's political movements. It's stressing people out and causing anxiety in the school systems with staff. People sometimes feel isolated, especially newer employees who aren't part of the culture. They don't understand the culture. A lot of times it's leadership not building in the teaching staff and additional auxiliary staff in buildings to work together as teams. People are massively feeling overwhelmed. I can tell you that that's an experience that I have, is feeling overwhelmed, and I know that I have to take time for myself and my family and how to remove myself from work, because I literally could look at my phone all day long because I'm getting messages. This week I'm on the West Coast, and people, even in my own company, it's 8 o'clock for them and it's 5 a.m. for me, and my phone's getting text messages and Slack messages. Sometimes it's overwhelming. Things that affect us, from incidents like Uvalde and Parkland, and there's progressive buildup of stress from incidents. And why do things keep occurring all the time? Why is responses not working? How do we get information? There's grief from the pandemic, deaths. People lost, we've lost over 1 million people. People lost parents and family, grandparents, and just general fear right now. It's very interesting talking to people, especially in light of the Uvalde incident. There's been a loss of faith in training because of that. The type of training that Uvalde had, there's been a lack of faith in law enforcement's response. We're seeing that from other incidents that are happening now where parents are attempting to rush into buildings, some of them armed, and it's adding all kinds of issues to these events. So that stress buildup, that fear of events that have occurred in the past and they could happen again, our isolation from each other in many instances, and isolation and anxiety and loneliness in general, those are all things that affect us. And how we overcome those and how we work with each other to overcome become extremely important. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about collaboration, it's collaboration on different levels. And one of the first things when we talk with, first responders and law enforcement, first responders could be security, they could be fire or EMS. Sometimes it's your own people. It's know the facility and know the procedures. The only way that occurs is I can't give someone a piece of paper and say, here you go, and send them out every day. There has to be orientation training. There has to be physical training. The school I'm at yesterday, they ran a massive drill. They ran a lockdown drill to an evacuation drill. And then they took part in the Great Shakeout yesterday, training for earthquake. And they spent a considerable amount of time yesterday morning on getting students to rally points and then conducting reunification with parents of students that were on the site. That's how they got to know the facility. And there were problems that were identified by myself and someone else, just one of the security directors, at a choke point in the school during the evacuation procedure where people were coming down a stairwell and then leaving a ground floor door at the same time. And it created a choke point where people weren't able to get out of the building fast enough. So it changes some of the policies and procedures that had to be in effect. So knowing those things are important, and being able to change them become important. Some schools have school resource officers who are integral parts of their planning and part of their training and part of their threat assessment teams, but no one else in the agency is involved. And those are things we need to start integrating more. Cross-function among departments. We have to think about everyone having a role, and that means everyone, in an educational, at a university, we're talking from the president level down to the guy who sweeps the floors. Everyone has a role, and it's an important role. Now, there may be different functions of roles, but everyone has a role within that facility, especially in keeping students and staff safe. But a lot of times people don't understand their roles. I'll read emergency operation plans in K-12 where it says the principal is supposed to be at the rally point, and the principal is supposed to be helping with reunification. And it doesn't say anything, or it even says they have to be at a command post. They're one person. They cannot be in 3 places at once. Who has roles that they can take up and step up into? How are they trained? And really the important thing is top-down modeling to establish cultures of safety. If people in positions of authority and leadership look at things to make things easier for themselves, it doesn't model the proper response for safety. An example of that would be, and I run into this all the time, is a door that should be locked that a superintendent or a CEO or a principal uses all the time, and they don't want that door to be locked because of convenience for them. That's a very simplistic example, but I can tell you that comes up in interviews again and again and again with staff, how the leadership is letting the building be unsecured and putting them in danger, putting students in danger based on the convenience of them going in and out. Those kind of things destroy the culture of safety. And even though it seems like a very small thing for convenience for a person, that destroys the safety and culture, because now everyone for convenience props doors, they leave doors open, and it just basically destroys the security atmosphere of the school. And that one small problem then balloons to where no one knows the policies, no one's following the policies because one single person is not following them. That should be modeling and establishing the culture. Can I have the next slide, please? But one of the things in establishing the culture of safety is empowering staff, letting them know how security procedures work. How do they make all calls in buildings? How do they train? How do they decide on evacuation? How do they decide on lockdown? What happens when they're outside? The staff needs to make all those decisions on an individual basis. During a crisis and an emergency, top-down control doesn't work because people in facilities are in different locations and buildings. They're outside. So what might work for one person in a classroom doesn't work out on a playground. So empowering staff to know what they should do at all locations and allowing them and encouraging them to make decisions and training them to make decisions definitely makes a huge difference in how staff responds. Also, the skills are transferable. One of the things that has constantly bothered me for the last 20 years is traditional lockdown response, that you have to be in a classroom, you have to get in a corner, you have to turn off the lights, you have to pull the drapes. That's not a transferable life skill. Fire training is very different. You learn fire training as a small child, and all of the things you learn as a small child, evacuation, putting towels underneath doors, stop, drop, and roll, knock your friend on the ground, extinguish the flames with your own body by rolling on them. Those are all transferable life skills that go with you through life regardless of the location. It's more you are trained to make a decision based on what the threat is for you for a fire. So when you're training safety in a school, if you always train in one location doing one thing, that is not a transferable life skill because you can't take it outside of the location itself. It has to be a productive environment. Do people allow after incidents to do things, I'll use a technical term here called a hot wash. That is in the immediate aftermath of training or an incident where the people who were kind of in charge during the incident, that's anyone. It could be cafeteria workers who were in charge of a a tornado drill that happened while they were in a cafeteria or an actual event. Are those people brought into the meeting after the event happened to give feedback to administration and staff and leadership that this happened in the cafeteria while we were in charge and had 300 students in it, and it didn't work very well, or it did work well, or we think there's a way to improve that. It's allowing everyone to have a basis and a strength in talking about the incident and letting themselves be heard and knowing that they're going to be heard. All of those things put together actually reduce risk. One of the things we were going through the process to be recommended as an expert service provider for the insurance industry was, are the things that we are doing actually reducing risk? And we had to have clients testify to that. We had to have all insurance companies that we did risk assessments on. We do risk assessments on insurance companies. That's one of the things we're known for. Does it actually reduce risk? And the answer is yes. And it's because we build all three of these things into that reduced risk. Next slide, please. So there's a poll question here, and I can't vote, but you should be able to. How confident are you your school's prepared for an effective collaboration? Now that we've talked about a little bit about that, are you very confident you can do it, fairly confident, not confident, or unsure? So if you would, while you're on, please check one of those so we can kind of get an answer to that. I'm always kind of curious when these poll questions come up, what the answers are going to be and how people respond. Usually a lot of times if you're on this, you're either very confident or not confident at all. So I don't know. I can't see the votes or anything that's happening right now. So should we go to the next slide? Yep. So very confident, 5%, fairly confident, 58, not confident, 32, and unsure, one person at 5%. So everyone's kind of falling kind of in those middle two categories. And not confident, that's kind of a scary thing. We'll talk about a little bit about what you need to do to get to the point where you're at least fairly confident in some of the things in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about the state of mental health for students. Next, please. So these are collegiate mental health statistics. I know from working at Kent State for 27 years, the very first month of school was always almost very hazardous with mental health because so many students are out for the first time and experiencing mental health crises without family members and some of their support systems in place. Sometimes we would get 6 or 7 mental health calls a shift. That's why even late in my career, I went to crisis intervention team training because I couldn't sit back and supervise anymore. We were all busy. Interestingly, 64% of students drop out of college because of mental health problems. You would think that would be a grading issue, something like that, inabilities to adapt to that, or just decide not to want to do college and go do something else. But it's really mental health is what is like impacting people, and the resources that are needed to help that. A lot of universities get that. I know when I was at Kent State, it was a big push for the university to increase our mental health resources because really, bottom line is it affects retention of students. It affects the collegiate atmosphere of the school, the safety of the school, how people feel about the school. And it was something that we really worked on addressing. Obviously, a lot of people know this, about 75% of mental illnesses appear before the age of 24. So these are students that are in K-12, they're in college. The quicker we can identify those issues with mental illness, the quicker we can get resources. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody. 9 in 10 students experience negative mental health symptoms. During the pandemic, a lot of it had to do with isolation and being overwhelmed. Just around 50% of students believe that COVID-19 impacted their educational mental health. This is a problem that is not going away anytime soon. If these students were in kindergarten, this is a problem that will likely follow them all the way through their education system. So trying to push resources in a 1-year, box to say, well, we need to increase our mental health resources this year for students because we came back from COVID, that problem's not going away, and it will continue to impact that cadre of students as they move through the education system. And hopefully we don't have any other, major events that will impact it. But those mental health resources will probably need to be in place at minimum and at a very high standard, probably for the next 10 to 12 years. 41% of US college students have depression. That's at various levels of depression. 33% of students who receive mental health services consider suicide. This is a huge suicide problem. Obviously everyone doesn't commit suicide, but this is an issue that needs addressed, and have resources in place to do it. Between 2 and 8% of college students are diagnosed with ADHD. This is sometimes a problem. I know in the dormitory, students that had ADHD sometimes were victims of bullying because of how they acted around other people. So those are issues that also need addressed. Next slide, please. When we talk about students' mental health needs, and I think these pop up one at a time here if you want to click. So students you know and expect, that's what you have in place right now. A lot of facilities, there's students that we know have mental health issues. We expect them to have mental health issues. We put resources in place to help those students. Please click. But really what happened was, after we came out of the pandemic, there were numbers of students that didn't have mental health problems, didn't have issues, that now have mental health issues. And you've noticed that numbers kind of doubled from what we initially prepared for. Next slide, or next click. What happens is, what actually is occurring is there are about 4 times as many students that are experiencing mental health issues than we originally had before the pandemic started. Like I said, this has been somewhat pandemic related. Probably the beginning of it was pandemic related, but there's other issues with staff. There's other issues that are affecting how students are relating to each other. Especially one of the examples, I have a 10th grade daughter. She did not experience junior high the way my older 2 children did. And while she's adjusted very well to high school, some of her friends are having trouble adjusting because the formative junior high years, where you kind of get some of the, I'll say this in quotes, stupid things out of your system in junior high, didn't happen. And now it's happening at the high school. The juniors and seniors at the high school last year were complaining because the freshmen and sophomores were destructive and they were destroying things in the building for no reason. There's limited staff, a lot of staff untrained, and limited resources to deal with this many students with problems. I tell people you need to start looking at hiring school counselors and psychologists and establishing resources for that next year by doing it now. Very important to get things in place and really focus on, a little bit beyond what we think is going to happen tomorrow to what we think is going to happen next year. Have a much longer outlook on the resources we're going to have to provide. Next slide. So we want to identify the focal point and understand that most students who have mental health needs do not pose a threat to themselves or others. This is one of the things that I really, I needed to work on when I came into the private sector, because I knew that at a very grassroots level, but working more with schools and education environments, most students that are experiencing behavioral issues aren't a threat to themselves. They're not suicidal. They're not going to attack people. They're not going to become active shooters. And that's where we want to interdict people with mental health resources. When we first see behavioral issues start to occur, things like dropping grades, people withdrawing from programs and students, that's when we want to start getting resources to them. Students that do have unmanaged mental health concerns, becomes an issue where they pose a threat to themselves and others sometimes. That's really where we need to decide we need to have intervention, we need mental health support. We'll talk a little bit how do you put that in place, what type of training do you give to people to recognize those needs. Because what we've realized is there's a significant link between unmanaged mental health and violence. At the federal level, it's recognized that about 40% of prisoners who are in federal prisons for violent crime have significant mental health problems. Sometimes at the local level, that statistic is in the 60s percentage-wise. That unmanaged mental health is a lot of times the problem with criminal activity that we need to address. Next slide, please. So the question's not if, but when a student will need mental health support. So we have to have training to understand why students withdraw. What are the signs of students withdrawing? Equip the staff to talk to students about suicide. It's not a comfortable thing to do. But if staff understands that that's starting to occur, that's what they need to be able to talk to them about. Crisis intervention training, very important. You know, and as a law enforcement officer, to understand that it's okay to talk to people about mental health concerns. A lot of times people who are having mental health concerns are very open about them and they want to talk about them. They're trying to find help. So understanding what kind of help they need and how to talk to them is extremely important. Have an assessment plan and a team in place. This is one of the things I see in the field that doesn't happen. People have a couple of pieces of paper that they scratch some notes on sometimes. They don't have a formal system. They don't have a formal scoring system. They don't have formal teams. It's a psychologist and a principal maybe making the decision. Sometimes it's just the principal and a counselor or a counselor making a decision. These are team problems. Behavioral threat assessment is a team exercise where you have counselors, potentially psychologists, law enforcement, teachers, principals, staff members with intimate knowledge of the student that deal with them. That could be a custodian that they talk to every day. That could be a cafeteria worker that they have a relationship in. Those are people that could end up being on a threat assessment team based on the circumstances. And knowing where to refer students for help, being able to recognize the signs of a student withdrawing and becoming a problem is not the same as knowing where to refer them to. And sometimes that's a missed piece. Next slide, please. So we're going to throw another poll question in here. Does your school have an effective plan to place student support in place to support student mental health needs? So you get a single choice here. Yes, we have a plan. Partially, we have a process for reporting don't sufficiently prepare to support the student. No, we're not trained or equipped to support student in crisis. Once again, you know, we can't vote. So that's good. No one that's in the room right now says that they're not trained. So about 28% of people partially have a process. About 72% say yes. So that's really actually fairly high. It's a lot higher than what I usually see in the field. Usually it's about a 50-50 split between yes and partially. I'm not seeing anybody who's not equipped at all anymore. If we can close that and go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about a comprehensive approach to threat detection and prevention. Next slide. So solutions work better together. Obviously, there's no, magic wand that you can wave that's going to solve every problem. And just if you do this, we're all good. So the basis for everything is behavioral threat assessment and suicide prevention training. These are the things that we a lot of times see in place, and what needs to be expanded are the numbers of people that are being trained. Sometimes in organizations that have several hundred employees, I'll see 4 or 5 people that have really good behavioral threat assessment, suicide prevention training, and no one else has anything. We need to kind of like get that training to the point where it becomes ubiquitous to everyone, that everyone has some level of training, even if it's the base level of being able to identify and report. And how do you report? How do you write this up? Who do you report it to? How do you understand the signs of what you're seeing? That formal training needs to go to everybody. And that's way beyond what we see for just having a team in place. Anonymous tip reporting system, very important. People need to understand how anonymous tip reporting systems work, that they're anonymous. What does that mean? Because sometimes, especially students, have ideas that, oh, this is a way they find out who I am. It's to overcome that process of people thinking they're constantly being watched or something like that. It's anonymous. We don't know who you are. We'll follow up on the tip. Showing that you're following up on the tip is important to the person who reports it, especially if it's anonymous, so that they can at least see that what they did is working, and getting them to understand that it's not some vast conspiracy, that it really is an anonymous system. Digital warning sign detection software, very important, inputting things. When you talk about things with behavioral threat and suicide and mental health case management software, these are all things that can kind of remove that little checkbox in a piece of paper, get put in a drawer and disappearing. When you have an emergency management suite, things like that can be put into the system and password protected, so that only people that are actually doing the reporting and receive the reports, do the assessments, they can see each other's scoring, they can go back and read different reports on different students, especially, as they go through the school system in a college. Do we have events as a freshman or a sophomore and suddenly they're okay, or has nothing occurred for 2 years and now suddenly the student's a junior and we're having behavioral issues in class, they're having mental health issues. Is it the onset of a mental health problem, or is it something that's going on in their life that's affecting them? So all of that, it allows also for you to track when positions and people change. There's been huge turnover just about every organization in the country the last 3 or 4 years. It provides continuity of history for people who need help. If one person leaves a school district or a university, that should not stop the system completely and having to start over from scratch. These type of systems, the detection software, the management software, really allow everyone who takes those positions up to continue with care for people and students without having a drop off in that benefit. Next slide, please. So when we talk about threat assessment, it's a problem-solving approach to violence prevention. I really work extensively now. I worked at one time on the response piece, but I really work on the prevention side of the house now. It involves assessment, threat assessment, risk assessment of facilities, and intervening with students who have actually threatened violence in some ways. Now, we have a note on this slide. It says transient threats and very serious substantive threats. Transient threats are usually normally what we're going to see. That's 75 to 80% of cases. That's the student that might say something, they failed a test and they're like, look, that's it, I'm going to kill this professor. When you do the threat assessment, did the student actually mean it? Does the student have the means and capability to carry it out? Has the student been violent in the past? What's past issues with them? Are there any past issues with them? Was it something just set out of anger? Yes. Stupid? Yes. But really, does the person going to do it is what comes into play. And that's why you have a team. Putting that type of decision-making process in one person's hands does not allow the full comprehensive assessment of something. When I went through NTAC training with the Secret Service, the individual who actually developed NTAC training for the Secret Service, I went through instructor training with them. And they were talking about this, that most times when a threat happens to the president and threats that they investigate, almost all of them are transient threats. However, there are ones in there that are identified by personnel as being very serious, substantive. So knowing what the differences of those are and how you understand those differences become extremely, extremely important when doing a formal threat assessment. Next slide, please. The purpose of the threat assessment is to prevent violence. Number one thing. Number two, help troubled students. This may be the transient threat. Is the person have communication issues? Does the person have a mental health issue? One of the things you don't want to do is overreact or underreact to student misbehavior. This is another important piece of why you have teams doing this, because you may have one person on your team, for whatever reason, they always kind of overreact to incidents. And there's people that underreact to incidents. Well, they didn't mean it. Or there's someone in the same room saying, oh, this guy absolutely is a problem. The decision-making process has to take both of those viewpoints into account. And really, it's based on actions, not people's thoughts or feelings. And that's why the software becomes important, because it helps prevent an overreaction or underreaction, because you're actually scoring behaviors. That's why the systems are set up. And that's why the Secret Service set up a system to help them do it. It prevents that personal viewpoint from being entered in. It actually is based on the actions and the ability of people to carry out violence. But the main goal is not to get people in trouble, it's to prevent violence and help students identify behavioral issues with them that may need assistance. And it may not be a student that makes a threat. You may not decide to remove them from the campus. You may decide that they need additional mental health, and they may understand that also, and getting them to understand mental health help. Next slide, please. So technology is important. I've been talking a lot about people and how we do things. Technology is important so that we can get safety-related awareness. It helps identify and scan things that people do. Then you can assess and analyze what's been entered. No more trying to print paper off and give things to people. The reports are entered. The team can look at it before they even meet and begin the analyzation process before they meet. And connecting the threat and validating the threat are two different things. The validation of a threat with what was said or written, or maybe even done, is that a threat that needs to be validated? And it's also to inform and engage everyone in the organization to help increase the safety awareness of the facility. A lot of times technology, digital conversations and the safety related awareness, those are important pieces that everyone misses. A lot of times certain groups and organizations see it, but if you're able to tie all four of these things in together, and I cannot stress enough that connecting and validating threats are extremely, extremely important. That's a lot of times where things fail. It's understanding all of those things, not putting all your eggs in one basket, to say, and making one person do all of this themselves. It makes teams together, and teams help organizations with its safety and security culture. Next slide. Things like anonymous tip reporting, very important. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Getting students to understand that they are the biggest eyes and ears. It is not the staff, it is the students. The people who have constant contact with their peers. They're probably the best ones to identify behaviors that are going wrong. Most of the tips and suicide reports, behaviors, anonymous reporting are made by students. They're not made by parents, they're not made by teachers, though they do make reports. It's 24/7 monitoring. They can enter at any time, middle of the night. There's ability to have anonymous two-way dialogue with tipsters that still remains anonymous, even though there's dialogue going on. It allows teams to be identified immediately or notified immediately if something happens. And it's very easily visibility at the school and access. And it's something you can really push out to students to help them, make them feel safer. And how to report, what to report. And they can even look into apps. I know most students don't have their phone in their hands 24 hours a day. This is something for them to actually look at and see and use in a very constructive way. Next slide. Digital warning sign detections and other things, software. This is for digital media, public posting on public sites. It allows sometimes people, it's called leakage, when they make a threat online or they tell somebody there's a threat, they post things, constantly talking about shooting people on websites that are public, things like that. It's immediate warning signs. Early warning signs that something could be going wrong, and it allows the facility to take immediate action and begin a behavioral threat assessment from what they're seeing in public posting and access. Next slide, please. So here's, I believe this is the last poll question. How comprehensive is your school's approach to threat detection and prevention? There's 5 categories here. So fill out the one you think is most appropriate for your facility. I don't see the timer on this, so. Answer, let's see, 3 out of 17, not sure what the approach is. One uses a single solution, multiple solutions in place. There's still gaps. I can tell you that one is the one I see most often in the field, that some organizations have some multiple solutions, but we identify some gaps in the things. That's good. 18% of people feel mostly confident, but no one feels fully comprehensive. Next slide, please. So the goal is to get to a place where everyone feels fully comprehensively. So strategies to encourage student participation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is violence against people and others is preventable, and we need to look at it that way. With students being in the best position to identify and report behaviors, that's the piece we need to really encourage and give students the ability to understand that they're not ratting someone out, that they're really we're really helping them. And this allows students to report it, and then intervention early on in the process before violence occurs, before crimes are committed. If we can get to the point we're doing assessments for students that are in distress that pose a threat, that will greatly reduce violence. And there has to be significant follow-up after it, in intervention and management of mental health issues with people. And it's a process that just doesn't end. A lot of people drop off, they identify the threat, and we've seen this in past incidents where some of the more serious active shooter events have happened, where there's been assessment, people have identified a problem, but there's no significant intervention to management afterwards. This is a constant process of connecting the dots. Are we bringing students back to school? Is there ongoing management of their problems, and constantly reassessing the student who made the threat to make sure they're continuing on the right track. Next slide, please. So next steps. If you're interested in connecting with one of our safety consultants to learn more about comprehensive solutions, you can share your contact information in the chat, and someone will get back with you on that. And I think I'm turning it over to Jessica now. I can't remember what the next slide is. Q&A, there you go. So I don't know if there's any Q&A questions from the audience, Jessica, that I need to address.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you for that very informative presentation. A lot of great information and detail shared. And there is, I believe, okay, so someone from Cuyahoga Community College is just requesting the PowerPoint. So I will mention this to everyone, that this presentation is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next coming days, as well as the PowerPoint slides. I believe we'll also be able to disseminate those as well on our listserv. So I do want to encourage you all, if you have questions and or comments to share, please feel free. You can type those in the Q&A and or chat functionality. We do have, I believe, just a couple minutes for a few questions.
And because I have a really weird background on things, you can pretty much ask me anything, I might know an answer to it. So, or if you're curious about something that we're seeing nationally as we work across the country that you're seeing, and attempt maybe validating some of the things you're seeing, I'm more than happy to answer that.
Absolutely. And while they're perhaps thinking of questions, I did actually have a question, maybe even regarding a resource. I know you mentioned that people are really willing to talk, and students really being in that best position to share. And I'm thinking mainly even about, let's say, resident directors or resident assistants. Are you aware, per se, of any specific trainings or resources that is being offered universally, or something that you would recommend for that particular group, being with their proximity to the student population and the residence halls?
So I know there's a big push in certain parts of the country, and it's happening here in Los Angeles, that they're providing crisis intervention training for staff members at universities at the RA and resident director level, because they're so in contact with students all the time. The big issue is, like, getting those people away so they can do a week-long course. Resident director is a little different because they're usually full-time employees and they can do some training in the summer and stuff. But they're looking at how do we train resident assistants. And I'm having a brain cramp right now for the mental health organization that runs that. See, Jessica, this is where I need you to help me out. I want to say NASRO, but it's not NASRO. But there's a mental health organization that provides resources to organizations to help train them. And I cannot think of the name. But
perhaps that could be a resource that,
yeah, there's resources there.
that we can even follow
I know
up with
sometimes
attendees
some universities have resources. They even have internal trainers that, work with students that do internal training that, are psychologists, psychiatrists, even high-end counselors that work with students all the time that can train staff. So like, what are you looking for? What kind of behaviors are you looking for? Do you have a student who, constantly doesn't leave their room or, doesn't interact with other people? And is it because they're just a very private person or is there something else going on there? So,
Absolutely.
sometimes those resources are internal.
Absolutely. That's a good point that you bring up because many campuses may already have, let's say, a training resource that they're utilizing and or that they're tapping into, but sometimes there may even be a national or maybe in a newer training that's available. And so that could be a very available resource to share as well.
There's things like NTAC and CSTAG that have training. Those organizations have training for people that, how to conduct these behavioral threat assessment, things like that. So they're great resources also.
Great. So we do have time for one question. I do think we've had one that's popped up. The question states, what type of approach do you recommend for a community college without residential facilities or commuter students?
So they don't have commuter students or they only have commuter students?
Only have commuter students.
Okay, only have commuter.
Yeah, it's for a community college.
So you're still looking at the same thing, but you don't have like resident assistants and resident directors, but you still should be training, your instructors, your graduate students, your staff members that work at the school, probably down to even like the groundskeepers, the custodial folks, maintenance, because they're not really, those are the people they come in contact with. They see the students every day. So while the resource isn't necessarily having to do with a residence hall or a dormitory, that staff still continues to need to be trained. You still need to have a formal threat assessment team at the university level. So, you have a place where these reports go. You need the systems in place to deal with the issue. Just because when I worked at Kent State University, we had, at 1.7 thousand students living in the residence halls, but that meant we had 33,000 students that weren't. So, and a lot of times the students that weren't just necessarily residence hall students were the ones we were dealing with. From outbursts in class, or they're, they collapse in, the parking lot and they're having problems, or they self-report and they need help. So we had all those things in place. So it's still important to have that formal system, a formal means to do the reporting and formal training for everybody. You just don't need the resident director, resident assistant pieces.
That's a great point. And with that being said, we are at 1 o'clock. And I can't thank you enough for the great information that was shared with Ohio campus stakeholders today. Joe, we appreciate your time. And one more time, if you are interested in claiming CME and CU credits, that activity code for today is 36WILL. And I believe that's just been reposted in the chat. That's 36WILL. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you on November 8th for our next webinar. Thank you again to Joe Hendry and Navigate 360 for presenting for us today.